It's just after 6:30 on the morning of the 1st of December, 1948. The sun is barely up over Somerton Park Beach, a stretch of sand about 11 kilometers southwest of Adelaide in South Australia. A couple out early spot a man near the seawall. He's lying back, head resting against a stone, his legs stretched out in front of him, ankles neatly crossed. He looks, for all the world, like someone who lay down to watch the tide and simply drifted off to sleep. But he isn't asleep. And nothing about him is simple. He's well dressed. Too well dressed, some would later say, for a man dozing on a beach. A crisp white shirt, a brown knitted pullover, brown trousers, socks, shoes, and over it all, a smart, double-breasted jacket in gray and brown. Whoever he was, he'd taken care with how he looked. This was not the appearance of a drifter. So what was he doing here, motionless against a seawall, at the edge of the sea, on a summer morning in Adelaide? There's one detail the police would fix on almost at once. Resting on the right collar of his coat sat a cigarette, half-smoked, unlit now, gone cold, not fallen to the sand, not crushed underfoot, but perched there against his collar, as though it had slipped from his lips at the very moment life left him, and never quite finished its fall. A small thing, a strange thing, the kind of thing that snags in the mind, and won't let go. Across the road stood the crippled children's home, on the corner of the Esplanade and Bickford Terrace. That's the spot. That's where he lay. In the early confusion, it seemed obvious enough. A man had died in his sleep on a public beach. Sad, but ordinary. That's what it looked like. That is not what it was. Detective Don O'Doherty filed the report, and when they went to piece together who this man was, they came up against a wall harder than the one his head rested on. No wallet in his pockets. No hat, which in 1948 was almost unheard of for a man dressed as he was. Nothing at all to say his name. He was clean-shaven, calm-faced, and utterly, completely anonymous. It was as though a person had simply been set down on that sand with every trace of himself stripped away. From the moment the tide went out on that first morning, the questions began to stack up, one on top of another. Who was the man against the wall? How did he die, propped there so peacefully, in what would prove to be top physical condition? And why had someone gone to such lengths to make sure that when he was found, he would carry nothing of himself at all? 70 years of investigators, pathologists, and amateur sleuths would chase those questions, and for most of that time, the sand would keep it secret. To understand that morning, you have to go back one night. Rewind about 11 hours to the evening of the 30th of November, 1948. The sun is going down over the Gulf St. Vincent, the sand is cooling, and a man is already lying against that same seawall, in that same spot, on his back, doing nothing at all. Several people would later come forward to say they'd seen him there. None of them thought much of it at the time. Why would they? A man resting on the beach at dusk is the most ordinary thing in the world. But when the police pieced their accounts together, the picture that emerged was anything but ordinary. The first sighting came at around 7 o'clock. A couple, out walking, noticed the figure stretched out near the seawall, and they saw him move. According to their statement, the man raised his right arm, extended it to its fullest reach, up into the evening air, and then he let it drop. Limp. Back to the sand. That was it. One slow, deliberate gesture and stillness. At the time, it meant nothing to them. A stretch, a yawn, a man settling in for a nap. But it would become one of the most dissected movements in the entire case. Was it a wave? A signal to someone? Or something else entirely? Then came a second couple. They had the man in view for a full half hour, from about 7:30 to 8, and during that window the streetlights along the Esplanade flickered on. 30 minutes. And in all that time, they told police, they did not see him move. Not once. Not a shift of the shoulders, not a turn of the head. Nothing. And yet, here's the strange part. They also had the distinct impression that his position had somehow changed. They couldn't say how. They couldn't say when. They simply felt that the shape on the sand was no longer arranged quite the way it had been. How do you move without ever being seen to move? It was the mosquitoes that finally troubled them. It was late November, an Adelaide summer evening, the air thick with insects rising off the damp sand. The couple watched the man lying there, exposed, unmoving, and they remarked to each other how odd it was. Because he wasn't reacting. No swat of the hand, no irritated shift, nothing that a living, sleeping body does on instinct when something crawls across its skin. Any of us, dozing on that beach, would twitch, brush at our face, roll over. He did none of it. So why didn't they go and check? For the simplest reason of all. They assumed what any of us would assume, that the man was drunk or fast asleep, a harmless figure sleeping off a warm evening by the sea. There was no reason to walk over, no reason to shake a stranger awake, no reason to invite an awkward encounter. So they carried on with their evening and left him where he lay. It's a small human decision, and it may have been made within hours, perhaps within minutes, of the moment everything for him was slipping away. But one detail from that night refuses to sit quietly. One of the witnesses told police she saw something more than just the man on the sand. Up at the top of the steps that led down from the esplanade to the beach, there was another figure. A man. And he was looking down at the sleeping shape against the seawall, just watching. She couldn't describe him well. She couldn't say how long he stood there, or where he went. But someone, according to her account, was standing over that dying man in the dark, observing. Who was he? A passerby? Curious about a man asleep in an odd spot? A friend? Keeping watch? Or something colder than either? Police never identified the watcher on the steps, and the witness never saw his face. When officers finally arrived the next morning, they compared the body to everything these witnesses had described, and the accounts lined up. Same position. Same spot against the wall. As far as anyone could tell, the man had lain there through the whole evening and into the night without ever getting up again. But there was one thing not a single witness could give them. Because in the fading light of that summer evening from a distance, on a darkening beach, no one had actually seen the man's face. So now the detectives crouch over him in the morning light, and they start with the simplest question any investigator asks. Who is this? He's lying just as the witnesses described. Head against the seawall, legs stretched out, feet neatly crossed, as though he'd chosen the spot to rest and simply never got up. Detective Don O'Doherty writes it all down. And the first thing he notices is that there's nothing here to write down. No frantic struggle in the sand. No sign of who put him there or why. Just a man, composed, deliberate, and utterly silent. They go through his pockets, and this is where the case begins to turn strange. No wallet. That's the detail that stops them first. A man dressed like this, in a good jacket and pressed trousers, and not a single coin, not a banknote, not a scrap of paper with a name on it, no driver's license, no letters, no train ticket tucked away and forgotten. Nothing that a normal person accumulates just by living. Where does a man keep his whole life, and how does he arrive on a beach carrying none of it? Then there's what's missing from his head. No hat. Now that might sound like nothing to us, but this was 1948, and in 1948 a man simply did not go out without a hat. It was as ordinary as wearing shoes. To find a well-dressed gentleman bareheaded on a public beach was, to the men standing over him, a small, wrong note, a little detail out of tune with everything else about him. He'd dressed with care, and yet he'd left behind the one thing every man of his time carried without thinking. So they turn to the clothes themselves, hoping the fabric will talk where the man cannot. A shirt is checked. The tie. The jacket, the pullover, the trousers. And here the detectives find something that no accident, no simple misfortune, could ever explain. The labels are gone. Every single one. Cut away. Removed. Stripped from the garments where a tailor's name or a laundry mark or a maker's tag would normally sit. Clothes carry stories, whether we want them to or not. Someone had gone through his wardrobe and erased every one. Line them up, these facts, and they stopped looking like chance. No wallet, no hat, no identification of any kind. labels sliced from every piece of cloth against his skin. This wasn't a man who'd lost his belongings. This was a man scrubbed clean of himself, either by his own hand or by someone else's, before he ever came to rest against that wall. To the police, one reading seemed obvious. A man who wanted to vanish, who carried nothing and left no name, was a man who had chosen the end. And so, early on, suicide became the working theory. But there was one more place to look. One record a body carries that can't be cut out with scissors. The teeth. Dental work is like a fingerprint written in enamel, unique to the person, matched against files held by every dentist in the country. Surely the mouth would give him a name. The impressions were taken, the comparisons were made, and they matched no known person, anywhere. A man of perhaps 45, well-built, well-dressed, lying in plain sight on a public beach, and there was not a single record on earth that admitted he had ever existed. So who, exactly, had they found? By the time the body reached the mortuary, the questions had only multiplied. Who examines a man like this, a stranger without a name, and tries to read the story his body still tells? That job fell in part to John Burton Cleland, a pathologist of formidable reputation. And when Cleland looked closely, one word kept surfacing in his notes: Britisher. The face, the bearing, the build, to his trained eye, this looked like a man of British stock. Aged, he estimated, somewhere between 40 and 45. But that was only the beginning of what Cleland saw. Here is where the case sharpens into something strange. Because this was no frail drifter who had crawled to the seawall to die. According to Cleland's assessment, the man was in top physical condition. His calf muscles were high and well developed, the kind you'd see on a dancer, or a runner, or someone who spent long hours on his feet. A healthy man, a strong man, a man whose body, by every visible measure, had years left in it. So what, then, had propped him lifeless against that wall in the small hours of the morning? Then there were the clothes. And the clothes, when detectives laid them out, told their own quiet riddle. A crisp white shirt. A tie in red, white, and blue. Brown trousers, socks, and shoes. A brown knitted pullover. And over it all, a double-breasted jacket in gray and brown. Well-made, fashionable. The sort of thing a man chooses with care. Nothing about the outfit screamed anything at first glance. It was neat, deliberate. The wardrobe of someone who wanted to look right. But look closer, the way the detectives did, and the jacket refused to sit quietly. Because the cut of it, the tailoring, was reportedly American in style. And this was Adelaide, in 1948, a long way from anywhere a man might casually pick up an American tailored coat. How does a Britisher-looking man, dead on an Australian beach, come to be wearing a jacket cut in the fashion of another continent entirely? Had he traveled? Had it been given to him? Or had someone dressed him to be someone else? And so the picture Cleland built was of a paradox lying on a slab. A healthy man in the prime of his strength. A face that read as British. A body that suggested vigor, discipline, care, wrapped in clothing that seemed to have come from somewhere else. Every detail was crisp, specific, precise, and every detail pointed somewhere different. It was as if the man had been assembled from mismatched pieces of two different lives, a living contradiction, laid out under the mortuary light. But the deepest contradiction of all was still waiting inside him, in organs that told a story no one examining that healthy body could have expected. The body went from the sand to a steel table in Adelaide, and the man who bent over it was pathologist John Dwyer. He came expecting the ordinary. A heart attack, maybe? A weak vessel that had finally given out in the night. Instead, he opened the body and found a puzzle that would follow him for the rest of his career. Start with the heart, because that's where a coroner usually finds his answer. Dwyer recorded it plainly. The heart was of normal size. Normal in every way. No blockage, no rupture, nothing torn or swollen. The engine that drives a man's life looked as though it had simply been switched off. Then he looked at the brain, and here the picture began to shift. Small vessels not commonly seen in a normal brain were easily visible now, swollen and congested with blood. Something had forced the blood to pool where it shouldn't. The brain was crowded, pressured, engorged. Whatever killed this man had left its fingerprints in the finest capillaries of his skull. The throat told its own story. The pharynx was congested. The gullet, the tube that carries food down into the body, was streaked with a strange whitening of its surface layers, and in the very middle sat a raw patch of ulceration. Something had scoured him from the inside. The lining had been eaten away. Lower down, the same signature repeated. Congestion in the second half of the duodenum, and in the stomach, the detail that unsettled everyone who read the report. Blood, mixed in with the food. His last meal was still sitting there, half digested, and it was streaked with his own blood. What does that to a man asleep against the seawall? Both kidneys, congested. The liver, heavy and dark, holding a great excess of blood in its vessels. And under the microscope, Dwyer saw the centers of the liver's tiny working units had been destroyed, breaking down as if the organ were being poisoned from within. The damage was everywhere at once, and it all pointed the same direction. But the strangest finding of all was the spleen. A normal spleen is a small, soft organ tucked behind the stomach. This one was enormous, firm, roughly 3 times the size it should have been. Dwyer described it as strikingly large. In a body otherwise built like an athlete, one organ had swollen far beyond anything he could easily explain. So he laid the contradictions side by side: acute gastritis, hemorrhage, extensive congestion of the liver and the spleen, blood flooding the brain. And yet the man himself, the muscle and the bone in that flawless heart, had been in peak physical condition. Everything about him said he should have lived another 40 years. Everything inside him said something had killed him with terrible precision. And Dwyer knew that meant one question could no longer be avoided. Inside the stomach, the pathologist found the man's last meal. A pasty. Just a humble baked pastry, the kind you could buy at any counter in Adelaide in 1948. Nothing sinister in itself, but the state of it told John Dwyer something precise. From how far the food had broken down, he judged the man had eaten it about 3 to 4 hours before he died. Do the arithmetic backward from an estimated death around 2 a.m., and you land somewhere in the late evening of the 30th of November. So here was a man who had sat somewhere, at some counter or some table, and eaten an ordinary supper. And then, within hours, he was dead against a seawall. Where did he eat it? Who served him? Nobody has ever been able to say. Suspicion, naturally, fell on the food. If a man dies suddenly, with a stomach full of his final meal, the meal is the first thing you look at. Was there something in the pasty? Something slipped into it? Investigators tested, and the answer came back plain. The pasty was not believed to be the source of anything. Whatever had killed this man in top physical condition, it hadn't been baked into a pastry at a supper counter. So the obvious explanation dissolved almost as soon as it was raised. The last meal was innocent. Which only sharpened the question. If not the food, then what? Dwyer was a careful man, a man of measurements and margins. He did not deal in guesses. And yet when he set down his conclusion, there was no hedging in it. I am quite convinced, he said, the death could not have been natural. Read that again from the mouth of a pathologist. Not probably unnatural, not likely something amiss. Quite convinced. A body he'd just described as being in peak condition, a heart of normal size, a man in the prime of his life, had died in a way nature simply does not arrange on its own. So if death didn't come naturally, and it didn't come from the pasty, Dwyer was left staring at the only door remaining. Poison. But not a crude one. Not something that leaves a scald across the tissue or a scream on the toxicology chart. His mind went instead to something quieter. The poison I suggested, he wrote, was a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic, a sedative, a drug that eases a man down, slows his breathing, loosens his grip on the waking world, and lets him slide gently under. It would fit, wouldn't it? A man lying back against a wall, feet crossed, looking for all the world like he'd merely fallen asleep. But here is where the case turns strange, and stays strange, because a theory is only as good as the proof beneath it. And when they went looking for the barbiturate, when they ran the test to catch the very poison Dwyer had named, they found nothing. No trace, no residue, no foreign substance in the body at all. The organs told a story of a violent, unnatural death, and the chemistry told a story of a clean, empty system. How do you reconcile a corpse that screams poison with a bloodstream that whispers innocence? One answer fitted the silence perfectly, and it was the answer that would haunt the case for decades. Some substances break down. They do their work, stop the heart, still the breath, and then quietly dismantle themselves inside the body until, by the time the tests are run, there is simply nothing left to find. An undetectable poison, a drug engineered to vanish. That was the possibility Dwyer's findings raised, and it was a possibility that pointed somewhere very dark toward the kind of knowledge ordinary people don't possess. A man who ate an ordinary supper, died an extraordinary death, and left a body that pointed everywhere and proved nothing. It fell now to the coroner to make sense of it. He would find he could not. So the case went to inquest, and this is where the whole thing begins to close in on itself like a fist. A coroner's job is simple, at least on paper. Say who died. Say how. Say when. And yet, sitting with the reports of the pathologists, the police notes, the witness statements, the coroner found he could not answer a single one of those questions with any certainty. Not the man's name, not the cause of his death, not even something as basic as whether the figure people had watched on that beach was actually the man lying in the morgue. Every thread they pulled came away in their hands. Start with the name, because that's supposed to be the easy part. There was no wallet, no papers. His dental records had been checked against every set on file, and they matched no known person on Earth. So the coroner had a body in perfect physical condition, a man of perhaps 40 to 45, and absolutely no thread that led back to a life. How do you rule on the death of a man when you cannot even prove he ever existed on any register anywhere? Then, the cause of death. The pathologist had stood before them and said plainly that this death could not have been natural. His organs told a story of congestion and destruction, a spleen 3 times the size it should have been, and yet every test they ran for a foreign substance came back clean, nothing. So the coroner was left holding a contradiction that refused to resolve, a body that screamed poison and a laboratory that found none. He could not, in good conscience, write down the word. And here's the detail that truly unravels the inquest. The witnesses. Those couples on the esplanade the evening before, who'd watched a man lying against that seawall, watched an arm rise and fall limp, watched a figure that never so much as stirred against the mosquitoes. They had seen a man. But not one of them had seen his face. They'd looked at a shape in the failing light, a silhouette in the dark once the street lamps flickered on. So when the coroner tried to connect that living, breathing figure to the dead man before him, he simply couldn't. Was it the same man? Nobody could swear to it. So picture the position the coroner was actually in. He couldn't name the man. He couldn't state how he died. He couldn't even confirm that the person witnesses described was the person on his slab. 3 of the most fundamental questions a death can be asked, and 3 open doors leading nowhere. The inquest, in the end, delivered almost nothing but the fact of a death itself. A man had died against a seawall in Adelaide, and the law was powerless to say more. But the case wasn't finished, because months later, someone would look again at the clothes he'd been wearing and find something sewn into them that no one had noticed. A tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper, hidden where a man hides the things he cannot afford to lose. The body had already given up almost nothing. No wallet, no hat, no labels. And for weeks, that seemed to be the end of what the man would tell anyone. But the clothing was still there, folded and cataloged, waiting in a police property store. And in the months that followed, Someone went back through those trousers one more time. Not the pockets you'd expect. A different one. A tiny, almost forgotten seam of fabric sewn high on the waistband. It was a fob pocket. A small watch pocket, the kind tailors once tucked just inside the trouser waist, so shallow and so easy to miss that the first searches had passed right over it. This time, a hand went in, and the fingers came out holding something no bigger than a coin. A scrap of paper, tightly rolled, pressed down into a corner most people would never think to check. Why hide anything there? And who had rolled it so deliberately? They eased it open under the light. The paper was thick, good stock, its edges torn rather than cut, one side ragged as if it had been ripped from something larger. And printed across it in a plain serif type were two short words: "Not English." Not anything the detectives in that Adelaide station could read at a glance. The letter sat there like a riddle, handed across a table with no explanation attached. The words were Persian, tamam shud. 2 words, printed and nothing more, carried against a dead man's hip through his final hours and left there, untouched, when everything else that could name him had been stripped away. He had no wallet, no papers, no identity of any kind, and yet whoever he was, he had kept this, rolled it small, tucked it deep. Why would a man carrying nothing at all choose to carry these 2 foreign words? The detectives worked what they could. The paper matched no local newspaper, no notebook, no ledger. Its texture and its torn edge suggested it had come from a book, printed and bound, then ripped so that only this fragment survived. But which book? And where was the rest of it? For now the scrap sat alone in an evidence envelope, a single torn corner of a page that existed somewhere in the world, complete, waiting. Here was a man who had erased himself so thoroughly that not even his teeth could betray him. And the one thing he had chosen not to throw away, the one message he had folded against his own body and taken to that seawall, was a phrase in a language he may never have spoken. 2 words torn from a page. The detectives could see the shape of a question now, sharper than any they'd faced so far. What did the words mean? And what book had they been torn from? 2 Persian words, no bigger than your thumbnail, rolled tight and tucked away where no ordinary man would ever think to hide anything. Tamam shud. To the detective holding it, they meant nothing at first, just letters in a script he couldn't read, printed on a fragment of cheap paper. But when the words were finally translated, they landed like the last line of a story. It is over. It is finished. The end. Who leaves the phrase, "It is finished," sewn into a hidden pocket next to their own dead body? It reads less like a note and more like a verdict, a curtain drawn. And the strangeness only deepened when investigators worked out where those 2 words had come from. They hadn't been scribbled, they hadn't been typed for the occasion. They had been torn, cleanly, deliberately, from the printed page of a book. The book was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of verses by an 11th century Persian poet and astronomer. Meditations on wine, on fate, on the shortness of a life and the certainty of its ending. For decades it had been a fashionable gift, the kind of slim volume a person might press into the hands of someone they loved. And the words tamam shud sit right at the close of it, the final line, the 2 words the poet uses to say, this is the end of the poem. So think of what the police were now staring at. A man with no name, no wallet, no labels in his clothes. And on him, hidden away, a single torn scrap carrying the last words of a poem about the end of everything. Was it a suicide note written by a poet's hand instead of his own? Was it a message left for someone else? Or was it something colder, a signal, a sign-off, a full stop placed there by a person who wanted the meaning understood only by the right pair of eyes? There was only one way forward. If those 2 words had been ripped from a real copy of the Rubaiyat, then somewhere out there was a book with its final page missing. Find the book, and you might find the hands that tore the page. So the police did the only thing they could. They went public. They put out an appeal, asking anyone in Adelaide who owned a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam to check the back of it, to look for the tear. It was a long shot. A single damaged book in a city of thousands, torn from a title printed in countless editions. The odds of it surfacing at all were slim, and yet the tear itself was distinctive, a fragment that would fit its missing edge like a key into a lock. Somewhere in Adelaide, a book sat on a shelf or in a glove box, with an answer pressed silently into it. All the police could do now was wait for someone to come forward. And when the book finally did appear, what detectives found inside the back cover would turn a strange death into something far darker. So the police did what police do when they've run out of every other thread. They went public. They put the 2 Persian words in front of the whole city and asked a simple question. Does anyone own a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam with the last page torn out? It was a long shot. A book of Persian poetry, printed decades earlier, in a nation of millions. How many copies were sitting on shelves in Adelaide alone? And of those, how many owners would ever notice that the final page was missing? And yet, someone did. A man came forward. He said he'd found a copy of the Rubaiyat months earlier, tossed carelessly onto the back seat of his car, which had been parked near Glenelg. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. A stray book, no owner in sight, easy to forget. But now, with the words Tamam Shud splashed across the news, he went and looked at it again. He turned to the back. And there, on the final page, was a clean tear where the closing lines should have been. Detectives compared the torn edge to the tiny scrap recovered from the dead man's hidden pocket, and it matched. Not roughly, not close enough. It fit, tear for tear, the ragged line of one piece completing the ragged line of the other. This was the book, the very copy the scrap had been ripped from. After weeks of a corpse with no name, no wallet, no labels, the investigators finally held something in their hands that connected directly to the man against the seawall. But a matched tear only tells you where the paper came from. It doesn't tell you who carried it, or why a fit young man in top physical condition ended up dead on the sand with a fragment of poetry sewn into a secret pocket. The book itself was ordinary, worn covers, aging pages, so detectives did what any careful investigator does. They studied it closely. They tilted it under the light, examined every surface, and it was on the inside back cover that something began to surface. At first glance, the inside cover was blank, empty, but when the light caught it just right, faint shapes emerged from the paper. Not ink, indentations. The ghost of handwriting pressed through from a page that had once rested on top, someone bearing down hard enough with a pen that the strokes had bruised the cover beneath. Marks you couldn't read straight on. Marks you could only see when the surface was angled against the light, like breath on cold glass. As the detectives coaxed the impressions into view, patterns took shape. There was a local telephone number. There was another number they couldn't place. And beneath them, lines of letters, grouped in a way that didn't spell anything anyone in that room could recognize. Not a sentence, not an address, something stranger, something that looked, to the men staring down at it, unmistakably like a code left behind by a man who had gone to great lengths to leave nothing behind at all. What had he written in those faint, pressed-in strokes? And who was meant to read it? The book itself gave up almost nothing. But it was what the pages could no longer hold that caught a detective's eye. On the inside back cover, when the light was angled just so, the faint ghosts of old handwriting rose out of the cardboard. Someone had once pressed a pen against the sheet resting on this very surface, and the words had bled through as indentations, invisible until you tilted the cover toward a lamp. No ink. Just a memory of pressure, and in those pressed lines detectives could make out something that stopped them cold. There were numbers first. A local telephone number, pressed into the board, clear enough to trace. And beside it, a second number that led nowhere anyone could confirm. Unidentified then, unidentified still. Why would a man carry 2 numbers hidden in the back of a book of Persian poetry? Who answered on the other end? The phone number would send investigators chasing a lead that only deepened the strangeness. But the numbers were not the part that would haunt cryptographers for the next 70 years. Below the numbers ran the lines that made no sense at all. Letters. Rows of capital letters, pressed into the cover in blocks, with strokes crossed out and rewritten. They did not spell words. They did not form sentences in any language a reader could recognize. To the detective squinting under the lamp, it looked for all the world like a code. A message someone had written in a hand meant to be read by exactly one person, and then torn away, leaving only the shadow behind. Investigators traced over the indentations, line by line, trying to fix each letter before the impressions faded further into the board. What emerged were rows that began, by most readings, with the letters W, R, G, X. A line struck through. Then more, tumbling on beneath. Was it the first letters of a poem, each standing in for a word? A shorthand? The initials of names? Every reading produced a different arrangement, because the marks were faint, and faint marks invite the eye to see what it hopes to find. The message went out to the sharpest minds available. Australian naval intelligence took a look. Codebreakers who had cut their teeth on wartime ciphers turned the letters over and over. If this was a substitution code, it was too short to crack, they concluded. Too little text to find the pattern that would unlock the rest. And if it was not a code at all, if it was simply a man's private scrawl, then there was nothing to break in the first place. Both answers left the same silence. The decades did not help. Amateur sleuths, mathematicians, statisticians, hobbyists armed with computers the wartime codebreakers could never have dreamed of, all took their turn at the four ragged lines. Some ran the letter frequencies against English text and found matches too loose to mean anything. Others insisted the letters were initials of a lost love poem, or a farewell, or a set of coordinates. Every theory sounded plausible for an afternoon. None of them held. To this day, no reading has ever satisfied the authorities on the case, and so the message endures exactly as it was found, pressed into cardboard, half erased, refusing every hand that reaches for it, a local phone number that could be dialed, a second number that answered to no one, and a handful of capital letters that may be a secret, or a code, or nothing but the idle marks of a man who left no other trace of himself. What was he trying to say? Or was he saying nothing at all? And we have simply been reading meaning into the shadows for 70 years. By the time the newspapers got hold of it, the man against the seawall had stopped being a body and become something else entirely. A symbol. A shadow with no face. Here was a corpse in peak physical condition, dead for no reason anyone could name, carrying nothing that could tell you who he was. And this was 1948. The world had barely exhaled after one war before it stiffened into another kind of standoff. Australia in that year was a nervous place. The Cold War had begun, and with it came a new vocabulary of suspicion. Secret files, defectors, undercover agents who might look exactly like the man beside you on the tram. Adelaide itself sat within reach of the nation's most sensitive work. The atmosphere was thick, with the sense that ordinary people might be hiding extraordinary secrets. So when a nameless man turned up dead, apparently poisoned, apparently erased, the question wrote itself. Was he a spy? It's the word that has trailed the case for 3/4 of a century, and you can see why it stuck. Consider what the investigators actually had in front of them. A man of Britisher appearance in a jacket cut in the American style. A body found in a position that suggested he'd simply drifted off to sleep. And a cause of death the pathologist was convinced was no accident, yet could not prove. Then there was the poison itself. John Dwyer had told the coroner he was quite convinced. The death could not have been natural, and he pointed to a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic. But here's the maddening part. The test came back empty. Whatever had killed this man had done its work and then vanished from his body, leaving the congested organs and the enlarged spleen as its only signature. a substance that kills and then disappears. For those who lean toward espionage, an untraceable poison wasn't a mystery. It was a method, the kind of thing you'd expect from a professional. And it fit disturbingly well with everything else about him, because the most striking feature of the Somerton Man was not what he carried. It was what he didn't. No wallet, no hat, which in 1948 was itself an oddity. No papers, no letters, no keys that led anywhere. Every label snipped from every piece of clothing he wore. Now, a man might lose a wallet. A man might go out bareheaded on a warm night. But who cuts the tags from his own shirt, his own trousers, his own coat? That is not carelessness. That is intention. Someone had gone to deliberate lengths to make certain this man could not be traced. Put it together and you understand why a nation couldn't look away. A man scrubbed of identity. A poison no one could find. A geopolitical moment that made everyone see agents in the dark. It was the perfect vessel for the fears of its age. A mystery that seemed to whisper that the great forces of the Cold War had reached down and touched a quiet beach outside Adelaide. And yet, for all the talk of spies and secrets, no one could actually prove a single thing. Which raised a harder question than any of them. If he wasn't a spy, then what on earth was he? So who was he? With no name, no motive, and no cause of death anyone could prove, the vacuum filled with theories. And every theory tried to explain the same handful of impossible facts. A man in peak physical condition, dead at 40. Every label cut from his clothes. No wallet, no hat, no identity. A body that congested and bled inside as if it had been poisoned, yet held no poison anyone could find. Start pulling on any single thread, and the others tighten. That's what makes this case so maddening, and so the explanations began to multiply. The first and simplest answer was the one the police leaned toward from the very beginning. Suicide. A man with no identification, they reasoned, was a man who did not want to be found. He'd carried nothing that could name him. He'd lain down against the seawall as though settling into sleep. And the pathologists believed the death was caused by a poison, perhaps a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic, exactly the sort of thing a person might take to slip away quietly in the dark. It was tidy, it was plausible, but it left one glaring hole. If he meant to end his own life, why go to such lengths to erase who that life had ever belonged to? And that erasure is precisely what fed the second theory, the spy. Consider the year, 1948, the Cold War hardening around the world, suspicion thick in the air. Here was a man of, in the pathologist's words, Britisher appearance, dressed in a jacket of reportedly American tailoring, every trace of manufacture and ownership carefully removed. No papers, no past. Some researchers argued that only a professional would strip himself so completely, and only a professional death would leave a body full of the signs of poisoning with no poison to be found. An undetectable toxin, a man who existed nowhere. It reads like the opening of a thriller, doesn't it? The trouble with the spy theory is that it explains too much and proves nothing. An undetectable poison is a marvelous storytelling device, precisely because you cannot test for it. Every dead end becomes evidence. Every silence becomes proof of a cover-up. But the pathologist never claimed espionage. He claimed only that he was convinced the death could not have been natural. The label removal, the missing wallet, the anonymous American-cut coat, all of it could point to a secret agent. Or all of it could point to something far more human and far sadder. Which brings us to the third theory, the poisoned lover. Some who studied the case saw in it not intrigue, but heartbreak. A man who came to this stretch of Adelaide coastline for reasons that were never established. A man whose death, if it was self-inflicted, might have been driven by loss rather than treachery. A man who chose a book of Persian poetry as the last object connected to him, a book whose closing words speak of things ending. It is a reading that trades the spy's cold calculation for something warmer and more devastating. But it, too, rests on almost nothing solid. On mood. On the ache of a well-dressed stranger dying alone in the sand. And then, 11 years after the body was found, a new voice entered the record and complicated everything. In 1959, a man came forward to tell police something he claimed he'd witnessed the night before the discovery. He said that he and 3 others had seen a well-dressed man walking along Somerton Park beach. And the well-dressed man was not alone. He was carrying another man across his shoulders. Think of what that single account does to the picture. If it's true, the man against the seawall may not have chosen that spot at all. He may have been placed there. Carried, still or already dead, and arranged into the posture of a man who'd simply fallen asleep. It would demolish the suicide theory and hand fuel to those who whispered of murder. But the witness spoke a decade late, with no way to confirm what he'd seen in the dark, or whether the man on those shoulders was the same man found the next morning at all. Was it a killer disposing of a body, a friend helping a drunk companion home, or a memory reshaped by 11 years of a mystery that refused to die? Every theory answered a question. Not one of them closed the case, and the only man who knew the truth was still lying nameless in a mortuary, keeping his secrets. Decades pass. The file yellows. Most people who worked the case are dead now, and the man against the seawall becomes a ghost story told in true crime forums and dusty newspaper archives. But in the lecture halls of the University of Adelaide, one man refuses to let it go. His name is Derek Abbott, a physicist and engineering professor, and by his own account, he first stumbled onto the mystery around 2007. He was not a detective. He was not a historian. He was a scientist who couldn't stop pulling at a loose thread. And the more he pulled, the more he wondered whether the answer had been sitting in a laboratory drawer the whole time. Here's the thing that stayed with him. Back at the original investigation, before the man was buried, they had made a plaster cast. A death mask of sorts, taken of the head and shoulders, capturing the face down to the fine details of the ears and the set of the jaw. But that wasn't all the cast preserved. Pressed into that plaster, embedded in it, were strands of the dead man's own hair, fibers of a person nobody could name, sealed away in a museum for the better part of 70 years. Abbott looked at that cast and asked a question the 1948 detectives never could have. What if the man's own body had kept a record of who he was? To understand why the hair mattered, you have to understand what had changed since 1948. In the years of the original investigation, there was no such thing as recovering identity from a few dead cells. Fingerprints and dental records were the frontier, and both had led nowhere. But by the time Abbott took up the case, the science had leapt into another dimension. DNA could be read. Family trees could be reconstructed from tiny genetic fragments, matched against databases of living relatives on the far side of the planet. The problem? The hair in that cast wasn't fresh. It was ancient, degraded, brittle, contaminated by decades of handling and plaster. Extracting usable DNA from it would be like trying to read a letter that had been left out in the rain for 70 years. Abbott's obsession was not a quiet one. It bled into the rest of his life. Along the way, his research into the case brought him into contact with a woman who was descended from one of the figures tangled up in the mystery, and reader, he ended up marrying her. The Somerton Man had, in the strangest way imaginable, rearranged the professor's own family. But personal stakes couldn't crack the science. What he needed was someone who could pull a genetic signal out of near nothing, who could take a rootless, damaged strand and coax a name out of it. He needed a specialist in the impossible. That specialist was an American named Colleen Fitzpatrick, a forensic genealogist with a background in nuclear physics and a reputation for solving cases everyone else had abandoned. She was one of the pioneers of genetic genealogy, the technique that reads a fragment of DNA and then traces it outward through the branching limbs of family trees until it lands on a single living relative, and through them, a name. Abbott had the hair. Fitzpatrick had the method. Together they set out to do something the original detectives would have thought was science fiction, to interrogate the dead man's own body and force it, at last, to speak. But wanting an answer, and being allowed to reach one, are two different things. For years, the debate raged over whether the body itself should be exhumed, whether it was worth disturbing a grave for a man who might never be identified anyway. And even when Abbott turned to the hair from the cast instead, the challenge was brutal. Rootless hair, old hair, the kind of sample that most laboratories would tell you flat out could never yield a clean genetic profile. He was chasing a signal that might not survive the reading. So the question hung there, exactly as it had for 70 years, only now with a scientist's hope pressed against it. Could a few strands of hair, pulled from plaster, actually give this man his name back? For 74 years he had no name, just a body against a seawall, a scrap of Persian poetry, and a code no one could read. Then, on the 26th of July, 2022, a professor at the University of Adelaide stood before the world and said something no one had been able to say since that December morning in 1948. He believed he knew who the man was. Not a guess, not a hunch, a name drawn from the man's own DNA, and the name was Carl Webb. The breakthrough came not from a fingerprint or a dental chart, but from something far smaller. Strands of hair. Preserved for decades, they carried genetic material that modern science could finally read. Working alongside Derek Abbott was an American genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick, a specialist in coaxing identities out of fragmentary degraded DNA. Together, they built a family tree from almost nothing, reaching outward through generations of distant relatives. How do you find a man's name when everything about him was stripped away? You follow the branches of his blood. The trees converged on one figure. Carl Webb, born in 1905, an electrical engineer and instrument maker, a man who worked with wires and precision tools, who measured things for a living. Suddenly, the anonymous corpse had a profession, a birth year, a texture of ordinary life. He was not born a mystery. He was a man who built and repaired instruments, who had a childhood, a trade, a place in the world before he became a puzzle propped against a wall. He went by Charles as well, Carl Charles Webb. Say the name out loud, and it sounds unremarkable, the kind of name that could belong to a neighbor, a colleague, a man passing on the street. And perhaps that was the strangest part of all. For decades, the Somerton Man had loomed as a phantom, a spy, a ghost of the Cold War. And here, at the end of the trail, stood something almost disappointingly human, an engineer born at the turn of the century, a person who had once been someone. The announcement landed like a thunderclap through everyone who had followed the case. For Abbott, it was the culmination of years of relentless pursuit. He had chased this man across archives and laboratories, refusing to let the mystery die. And now he claimed to hold the answer that generations of detectives, coroners, and amateur sleuths had failed to find. A name. After all the theories, all the dead ends, all the coded letters that resisted, every mind that tried to crack them, the science of genetic genealogy had done what old-fashioned detective work never could. But an announcement is not the same as a verdict. Abbott and Fitzpatrick were confident. They had traced the blood, built the tree, arrived at Carl Webb. Yet the identification rested on their own analysis, on genetic genealogy, on inference reaching back through the branches of a family none of them had ever met. Convincing, yes. But conclusive? That word belonged to someone else entirely, and the ones who could turn a claim into an official truth had not yet spoken, because there was still one more door to knock on, and behind it, silence. So there it was. A name, at last, for a man who'd spent 74 years without one. Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer born in 1905, pulled back into the light by DNA teased from a few strands of preserved hair. You'd think that would be the end of it. You'd think the story could finally close its own book. But here's the strange part. The people whose job it is to say who the dead are, the ones with the official stamp and the final word, have never confirmed it. South Australia Police and Forensic Science South Australia have not verified the result. Not rejected it, notice, just not verified it. They were hopeful they'd be able to, hopeful the science would line up, and the case could be formally, officially put to rest. Yet the name that made headlines around the world in July of 2022 still sits in a peculiar limbo, believed by many, sealed by no one. How can a man be identified and unidentified at the same time? And even if the name holds, look at everything it doesn't answer. It doesn't tell us why he lay against that seawall at Somerton Park. It doesn't tell us why every label had been cut from his clothes, why he carried no wallet, no hat, no way to be traced. It doesn't tell us what put congestion in his organs and blood in his stomach, when tests found no poison at all. A name is not a reason. A name is just the first door in a house full of locked rooms. Then there's the writing. The faint indentations pressed into the inside back cover, that string of letters that looks so much like a code, still has never been deciphered in any way that satisfies the authorities on the case. Cryptographers, hobbyists, mathematicians, they've all had their turn. Decades of eyes on a few pencil ghosts. And the message, whatever it was meant to say, keeps its silence. Was it a cipher? A drunken scrawl? A shorthand only one dead man could read? That's the thing about this case. He gives you an answer and takes two more questions in exchange. Derek Abbott chased it for the better part of his life and pulled a name out of the dark, and it may well be the right one. But the man against the wall is still, in every way that matters, a stranger. We know what he ate. We know how he sat. We know two Persian words that meant it is finished. We just don't know why any of it happened. Tamam shud. It is over. Someone tucked those words into a hidden pocket, as if to have the last word on a life. But more than 70 years on, the case they belong to is anything but finished. The dead man has a name that no one will confirm, a message that no one can read, and a death that no one can explain. So what do you think really happened on that beach at Somerton Park? And who was the figure watching from the steps? Tell me in the comments. Tell me which unsolved case you want next. And subscribe to stay with the Unsolved.